It's my great honour to welcome you all.
It is a very prestigious award. It means the world to me.
They have great senses of humour.
I like to reveal parts of history to them, for I love making history come alive.
They are some of the best people that you can come across.
To help them open their hearts.
I always come back to this quote. How can we be role models to learners if we're not learners ourselves?
It's quite useful to get out of our bubbles, not our COVID ones, and sort of see what else is out there.
By sharing best practice, we can see the whole picture. We can see what really matters.
One of the biggest brains around.
It's easy to forget how much has to happen behind the front line.
As a global schools group, Cognita educates over 55,000 students across 12 countries. We're proud to be Wellbeing Partner at this year's Festival of Education, and we want to share the work that we're doing to prioritise children's well-being. This starts with a clear understanding of what well-being is. We looked at the evidence and created a simple Be Well charter that everyone can use day to day. It gives a clear definition of well-being and then focuses on the specific contributors that influence it. Discover our full Be Well charter video and other resources to use with your students and families at cognita.com.
I really try to not look at myself as just a science teacher. I feel like as a teacher, it's very important to help students grow and develop outside of your lessons. A single teacher believing in you and really believing in you. One teacher doing that can have a large impact, but if you have one or two or three all telling you that and really, really believing in it, it makes you feel like you can achieve anything in the world, honestly.
Welcome to this Festival of Education keynote session, part of the annual Festival of Education, taking place online from the 16th to the 30th of June. This year's festival is free for all teachers and educationalists across education in the UK and beyond. This has only been possible thanks to the support of our incredible partners. A huge thank you to our headline partner, Pearson, our festival partners, BBC Bitesize, Cognita and Teach First, our literary festival partner, Bloomsbury Publishing, and our organising partner, Wellington College, the home of the Festival of Education. We'd also like to thank our incredible speakers. Over 200 leading educationalists and thought leaders will be providing sessions at this year's festival. On behalf of the audience and organisers, thank you. It's time to sit back and get set for our upcoming keynote session. If you wish to ask a question during this session, please head over to our Slido page to submit questions and vote for your favourites. Enjoy this Festival of Education keynote session.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our next festival keynote session. I'm really delighted to have Tom Sherrington, an absolute legend within the education sector, and certainly one of our stars of the Festival of Education for many years now, when we traditionally at Wellington College. So without any further ado, because I know Tom's got a packed presentation to give you this afternoon, I'd like to welcome Tom Sherrington.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm really pleased to be talking at the festival, and thank you for joining us, whether you're watching live or recorded. And I'm going to share my screen now so we can get straight in. So the theme of the talk here is great professional learning, one system, three streams. I'm going to sort of set out a kind of set of ideas for how I think professional learning works well in schools and colleges, and give you some idea of kind of the content of it, as well as kind of some structures. I think it's a fascinating process. I do this all the time. I'm constantly delighted and amazed by how interesting it is to work with teachers. I love working with teachers because teachers are so unique and special. And I get the privilege of sitting at the back of classrooms and then talking to teachers. And every teacher is different. They've got their own perspective. They've got a set of beliefs and values and a kind of sense of mission. And they're very variable. And this is what, if you think of teachers that you value and that you've worked with, or if you are a teacher, you think, if you've got children, you think, who do I love my children being taught by? There's a kind of character, a kind of idiosyncrasy about a lot of teachers. And I think that's really important. And when we're celebrating teaching, how to make it better, that we harness that individuality. At the same time, teaching has a kind of evidence base, and it's not as if it's sort of totally mysterious. So we're trying to sort of build great teachers and use what they have and create a climate where they themselves can continually improve. And there's all sorts of variables, and sometimes it's their value system that's an interesting thing about a teacher, a set of prior experiences where this is what they believe works because this is kind of how they felt it's always been for them. Some teachers are much more self-aware than others, like they have a sense of, now, when you've observed them and you talk with the lesson afterwards, you kind of agree that, yeah, that was working well, that wasn't so effective. And you agree because you see things the same. And other times you're at odds with each other. That teacher's perspective of what was working for them isn't quite what you were seeing as an observer. And all those things are the variables that we're interacting with, and we're trying to support a teacher to improve. Sometimes it's the theory of action that I've underlined there, that their model for what they think happens when children learn is different to yours, and you kind of have to thrash that out so that you can find common ground. So there's so many interesting things here. So what we need in schools is have systems which allow all this stuff to happen and to be discussed, so that we can create a kind of a process which allows that teacher to be a more effective version of themselves without feeling they need to be somebody else. And I do find a lot of teachers who are a little bit resistant to some of these things because they feel they've been criticized, chastised, almost made to feel that they should be someone else. This is me, this is what I like doing, and you're telling me that that's not good enough or something. And that's a very unhealthy position to be in. Whereas if the mindset is, I'm good as I am, but I need to find other ways of maybe making more learners learn even more and be more effective, then I can kind of get on board with that. I've often used this rainforest analogy then to sort of engage with this, which comes from the Learning Rainforest book I wrote a few years ago, where you've got a set of values. We all do. Everyone has values, things that you believe in, things that you believe to be true, that you give value to. And there's evidence. There's things from studies into teaching, and there's also evidence from our own experience and our assessment and more sort of objective evaluations of what's working. And what we do is we sort of weave those things together to create a sort of set of guiding principles. When we go into the classroom, these are the things I hold to be true about teaching, which are guiding me. There's a mistake to think that it's sort of the evidence from, say, research trumps a value system which comes from perhaps more organic kind of sources, or it's the other way around. They're always at play, even if we sort of talk about one more than the other. And in the learning rainforest, I use this analogy of the trees, where they can represent students, but they can also represent individual teachers, where we want to create conditions where teachers can flourish, but they're not the same. So in the rainforest, the trees can be different. They can take multiple forms. They can be magnificent in their own way, without being mandating the precise form of that. But trees grow because of biology, which is understandable. There's a logic to it. And so it's not like it's some sort of magic beans thing where who knows how it happens. We do know quite a lot about how learning works, and also about how teachers develop. But what we need is to create conditions for that to happen. So here we talk about the joy of it and also the challenge. And a good professional development culture has those things about it. It's rigorous, but also joyful. And I do really think that can be done. We're also talking about what's possible. So we have ambitions. We're saying this: what's the most incredible sort of school we can create here? What's the best curriculum and teaching kind of process we can imagine? Let's explore that. But in order for that to happen, teachers, I think, need good knowledge about effective practice and about themselves, so that they can make good decisions. And a lot of training really focuses in that central area, building knowledge that teachers have to have in order to be very successful, especially when it's around a whole group of people. An important thing for me to stress, and I feel I need to say this sort of thing quite often, is that we've got to make sure that the research that we care about and that we embed into our practice is the things which influences the things we do all the time. So it's the things which are going to change our habits as teachers. Teachers are incredibly strong creatures of habit, because you do lots of things all the time. It's easier to get through the day and the week if you've got routines, and so you haven't got your headspace to constantly invent new things, so you do things the same as you did before. Now, if you want to change that, we have to still think about changing habits, not the picture there on the left, the speed camera behaviors. And I have come across numerous examples where sometimes inadvertently a school has created a speed camera culture where, I was in a lesson, not so long ago, where all of a sudden the teacher, kind of recognizing there was an observation sort of process at hand, reached for this sort of pot of lolly sticks, because he was thinking, oh, lolly sticks, I'm supposed to do randomized questioning, and he started pulling the names out. But actually, the first two students whose names came out of the thing were people who'd left last year. So it's obvious that the lolly sticks cup hadn't been used for quite a while. And you're thinking, okay, you've done this because you think we're going to be pleased to see it. This is not something that you should do every day. And it's a false thing. It's no good to the children because you rock out a questioning technique because you're being observed. And when that's happening, you think, okay, the culture's not right here. We need to build habits which are sustained, where the teachers are working on things because they have an ownership of it. It feels like it's supporting them to solve the problems that they're experiencing and that their students are experiencing, and not to serve some external kind of accountability process where we just do it when we're being watched. And that's an easy thing to say, but it needs to be looked at. And there are various other things that go wrong with CPD. I'm only going to have one more sort of negative slide, and and there are various barriers. I wrote about this a long time ago on one of my blogs, and this is the sort of list of things I came up with, where sometimes professional development doesn't have enough time. Sometimes it's the bang and the whimper, the classic big inset day, the big launch. We're all doing metacognition, and then nothing happens, and it doesn't change a single lesson for a single student. Or the jaded eye rollers of doom and crush the spirit of it all. They're just sitting there shaking their heads in dismay, and it puts everyone off trying. Or the opposite, the hyper puppy evangelists. So you've got, Dave has got his new thing that he's gone on a course and he needs to tell everybody about it, and it's all enthusiasm, but no structure, no follow-up. It doesn't mean anything to anybody else. Again, dies a death. And there are lots of these things that people have experienced. But fortunately, CPD has been studied, and really good documents like this is now, 6 years old, this document. Great development. That we do know more about how good professional development works, and there are some important features that we need to think about. And here's some of the things, and all the things I'm going to talk about in this talk include this. They're built in so that they're not sort of vulnerable to the vagaries of the calendar suddenly disappearing. It's like there's a regularity to professional development moments in a calendar over time. And everybody knows when they're in one session when the next one is. So there's a kind of rhythm to it. So this session is reflecting on the last one and planning the one after so that there's time in between. And that's a really important part of a good professional process. So people think when they hear CPD, they think process, not event. It's about students. So when we're talking about what's working, we're thinking not how do I feel while I'm teaching, but are my children producing better work? Are they learning more? Are they more confident? And that's what we're focusing on. That we have time to process things. So we have time to chew things over and say, I'm not sure about that. And why does that work? And yeah, I'm not happy with that. I don't see how that's going to make a difference to me. Or why would that work? And we have time to question things, to build alignment, because we talk about problems, difficulties, opposing views. And if we don't do that, it's not as if teachers just go away and suck it up and go, oh, well, never mind. I'll do it anyway because I've been told. No, they don't. They just say, never mind. I wasn't allowed to express myself and I'll just resist and I just do what I want to do anyway. And teachers will do that sensibly because they shouldn't just be doing things that they're not given time to think about. So good CPD allows alignment to be built through discussion and exploration. And team culture is key. I think this is so interesting. Like if you scan a typical school, there's no such thing as a school culture really in a professional team. There's team cultures which add up. And I see that everywhere I go. The year 1 team is slightly different from the year 6 team. The maths department is slightly different from the English department. And there are various sort of nonsense cliches around the typicalities around that, but I just find they're all very variable. But you can find teams which are really on board. I know an FE college I work with where I'm thinking of a particular department where they're just so fantastic. They embrace everything. They co-plan a lot. They do a lot of modeling in their CPD sessions. They're always up for things and their outcomes are outstanding. They love this whole process as a team of constantly trying to do better, It's inspiring. And another team, that same place where it's just the opposite of that. They can't see the problem with anything. They never try anything out. They're all sort of off in their own directions. And you feel like, it isn't working so well. And the culture of that team is the issue. And it's constantly an issue that we're constantly discussing about how do we make them feel more bought into this process and get them to understand how to generate that. And of course, then you need room. There's a lot of effective CPD can have elements which are everyone's doing the same because that creates alignment and a kind of sense of common purpose, as well as room for people to do the things they want to do because it's more personal. And neither one of those things on its own is the right way to do it. It's the combination of the tight and the loose, the everyone together and the autonomy. And it's a much more sophisticated picture than saying it should all be done in a certain way. There are various other things. This comes from our Walkthrus book, the Walkthrus Volume 2, where we've had a nice sort of summary of some ideas from Sam Sims and Harry Fletcher Wood included in there. And they have written a really good paper summarising some of the themes around professional development, and we've summarised them here. So one of them is the idea that CPD should be sustained. It's not really the length of time that actually a program runs for, so much as the frequency of iterations within it. So you can do a very long program which has sort of big gaps in between the sessions, which ends up not making any difference. So a sort of poor program that runs for a long time isn't necessarily going to make as much difference as a short, punchy program with lots of frequent iterations. So there's a really good process called Teaching Sprints, which is run by Simon Breakspear in Sydney, and there they do a 4-week kind of punchy process, and it's really it has a lot of impact, but it's short and punchy and has a regularity to it. Practice space. There's a good debate around that. Do you have to practice strategies outside of classrooms before you go in? And what Sims and Fletcher Wood are saying is that not necessarily. I mean, there are studies which a lot of people like the Uncommon Schools movement, Doglamov and so on, would say that it's good to practice in kind of sessions and get practice outside the classroom. The sort of analogy that you practice, in the training ground before you get onto the match scenario. But actually, the truth is that in the UK, especially, most teachers don't do that, and they can improve. And it's not absolutely required that you do that kind of practice phase. But it's interesting. So it's an interesting discussion about the studies around that. Does it have to be subject specific? Well, not necessarily. There are programs that should be shown to be very effective, teaching generic questioning strategies, for example, or other aspects. So we have to be careful about being too general about this. Some CPD can be really good when it's for everybody. Others need to be much more subject specific. So I found in my practice, for example, if we're talking about modelling and scaffolding, ultimately, well, quite quickly, actually, you get to what am I modelling and scaffolding? And so we have to talk about modelling and scaffolding for a specific thing, like in writing for history in year 10. And that the general ideas about scaffolding don't last very long before you've got to talk about something quite concrete. But other things like cold calling or checking for understanding or some general principles of retrieval practice can really work with a lot of different teachers from a lot of different subjects. So I think we need to be nuanced around that. Does it have to be an external? There's a debate about whether it should be internal or external. Well, I think Sims and Fletcherwood are very useful, but they say it doesn't matter who says it; it's the ideas that matter. So having some expertise is what's useful, but it could come from anybody. But do they know what to say? So it's the ideas, it's what's being introduced to people that matters. And finally, teacher buy-in. Do you have to sort of say, I need you all on board before we do this process? What they're saying is, no, not necessarily. Sometimes buy-in is an emergent product of a good program. So a program which people are kind of forced to do against their will, that is good and leads to some good outcomes, can secure buy-in. So in other words, if you sort of constantly think teachers need to choose so that they buy in, that could be wrong. It's not necessarily the way things work when it's studied. So successful CPD is complicated, isn't it? They might have some preconceptions around it. So it's really worth looking at the detail and say, okay, it's always a bit more subtle than some surface sort of messages might seem. This is a go-to for a lot of people, the Practice with Purpose paper from Deans for Impact. I reference this a lot, and it does take a lot from Erickson's work. If you've read Peak, a lot of their references are to that. And the general principles of deliberate practice pertain to, are relevant to CPD. And I find this really useful to reference all the time, that teachers need to do this. I actually wish I'd call the first step push just beyond, because when you read it, what they're saying is, when you're trying to get a teacher to improve, or that you're trying to improve yourself, you don't sort of make some giant leap in your practice. You don't suddenly, use this new strategy and now I'm all of a sudden better. That isn't how it works. What works is that we push just beyond. We do something slightly different to what we're already doing. So we're sort of consolidating a lot of our existing practice and then tweaking it to move forward in the right direction. And if we encourage teachers to do that, they're more likely to make that change and secure it and embed it into their habit. If you're asking people to do something way beyond something they feel they're capable of doing, they're more likely to give up on it and not sustain it. So that's important. So push just beyond is really a good idea. And then specific goals. So, when you're thinking about what to do with your training, you've got to be getting people to think, how do I get my year 8s to emulate the models of writing more successfully so that after I've modeled, their practice is more successful? That's what I'm trying to do. Or how do I get my year 5s to add those slightly more complex fractions? That's what I'm struggling with. That's what they're struggling with. That's what my goal is. It's not, can I jazz hands it more effectively at the start of the lesson and be more performance? It's not about more of a performer. It's not about you. It's about them and their learning in quite a specific situation. That's what we should be focusing on, which leads us to choose the strategies relevant for that, for them. And it's just about critiquing the teacher as if like, I am generally now a better teacher. It really isn't like that. It's just, am I now more effective at securing the learning of that type? Is a much more useful and impactful way of considering this. And then we have to focus on it. Once we've identified that's what we're trying to work on, we have to keep going with it. There are very few things you get better at by sort of flitting around and having a go at this and having a go at that. You get better at things by sustaining some effort around that and keeping working on it and crafting it into something more sophisticated and more nuanced and more impactful. And that requires you to have the time and space to keep going with something. So CPD strategies, which tricks and tips of the week, are okay if people are kind of already have got a main agenda and those things are kind of in the background. But if you're expecting your main CPD to be each week a new theme, as if that's going to have impact, well, it really won't. You're just adding to the list of things that teachers aren't doing rather than, helping them actually do more things. And then we need some kind of feedback. This is key. How do we know it's going well? Now, feedback can be from an observer. That can be part of feedback, but really it can come from within. So feedback can be about, I think, about assessment information, about just simply asking yourself the question, how do I know it's going well? Assessment information, checking the students' behaviours in a class. And of course, part of that can be trusted feedback, but for me, it has to be trusted feedback. So it says on there high quality feedback, but to me, high quality feedback includes the idea that it's feedback you are going to listen to. So the process of generating that feedback we're going to look at. And finally, the mental model. I think it's just excellent as they include this, that if we're going to sustain our practice on something, it's because we believe in it, and we believe in it because we understand it and it makes sense to us. It's not because, like lolly sticks in the jar, I'm supposed to do it, so I'll do it. I do it because I can see that by doing this, it's going to lead to me solving those specific learning problems. So there's a logic, a rationale, and I'm forming a mental model as I'm doing my practice around the reason why things work, the reason why things don't work, and that's helping me. And that's part of it, and that's an explicit part of the whole process. So for me, that's a really superb outline. Now, this is where we get into the three streams. Typically in a school, and I find increasingly when I'm working with teachers and head teachers or leaders who are trying to design these things, I feel like we need to look at these three levels, because people are always an individual. Usually they're in a team of colleagues that they spend a lot of their time with, as exemplified with the culture issue. I'm a maths teacher. I spend a lot of my time talking about maths with my maths colleagues, and that's kind of my identity. For some people, that is their identity. You ask some primary teachers, they're a year 4 teacher. They'll define themselves as a year 4 teacher, and they have been for a few years maybe, and their team might be just their colleague. And if it's a smaller school, it can be more phase orientated. And then, of course, there's whole school. So each one of these has the capacity to make an impact on a teacher's practice to solve a learning problem. And I think it's worth being really deliberate about thinking through these things and seeing how they mesh together. It actually looks more like this. So it's deliberately complicated. A good school program does have this complexity to it. You've got whole school systems which are going along. You've got the launch day. You've got new ideas brought in. And it's perfectly sensible to say, what ideas do we need everyone to have, like to share some insights into learning, some whole school themes which are relevant to the students' outcomes, which are really important for us all to understand the language, the key concept. Let's plan those things. But then they need to feed into systems where we then make sense of them in relation to our specific environment of the curriculum in our classroom. So team processes are really probably the main driver. Like, this is where we thrash out what metacognition means for science teaching, or what scaffolding means for writing in a certain age group, and the team process. Now, if we don't think about how teams behave, there's a whole ton of activity which can be very left to chance, and some teams are much more highly functioning than others in terms of running their processes, like their professional development processes. And then within that, you've got these other activities. And there are lots of different ways teachers can collaborate. They can just be on their own, flying solo. They can be working in pairs. They can be working in triads. They can have triads who are monitored by someone, or they can have a coach. So instructional coaching, which I'll come on to, is just one of the ways that teachers can sustain their practice in between their team meetings. But all of these things happen in parallel, and it's important to recognize that they do. And then what we're doing within all of these, we're getting people to look at this process. Now, we're getting too bogged down in the detail. Essentially, the whole time you're getting teachers to think, okay, so how am I doing now? What's good about my practice? How do I know that? What's good about my practice in relation to the problems that the children have got that I'm trying to solve? What might it look like to be more effective? So that some sort of common framework, some reference point, some toolkit, or as Jim Knight, the wizard of instructional coaching, would say, the playbook of strategies that I might refer to say, what are the sorts of things that are contenders for things I might try? What are they? Do I know what they are? Because teaching I don't have to invent it constantly. It's kind of knowable and known, but we need to know what's available to us. And from all of that those things, what am I personally going to do? That's an important question. So here's all these things that I might do, but then there's things I need to think apply to me. So, and I know myself. There are some ideas that you hear about and you go, oh, that sounds great, but I know I can't see myself ever doing that. It's just not going to happen for whatever reason. And even from that list, you then have to have this sub list of, okay, from all the things that I think I could do myself, what am I actually going to do? Like the actual intention. And some CPD processes fall down right here, that the good intentions are there. They just don't ever happen because they're not followed through. So this is absolutely vital. A good CPD process deals with all of those questions. Teachers being able to work out for them what they need, how to improve, what a better version might look like, filter down strategies which are useful, and then sign up to some intentions, which are things they will actually do on their own, like because they've decided to. If they don't, they'll go into their lessons tomorrow and next week teaching the same as they did before. And the whole CPD process has happened, but no change has gone on. And that is very common. There's a lot of CPD noise can be generated without change happening in the classroom, unless that final question is answered and there's a system of following through. What sorts of things might be discussed? So it's not, like there's a sort of a total sort of range. I often find myself talking to people about behavior, about questioning, about the knowledge, what exactly do you want the students to know? How do you know they have learnt it? What are the standards? Was that good writing, or what would better writing look like? Do you know what good writing was? How do the students know what excellence might look like? And then sort of things like feedback, how would they know to improve? How would you communicate what's the best way for them to know? So these are very common areas. Teaching isn't sort of surprisingly open. There's lots of very common themes which emerge, which is helpful because it means that we can create some kind of coherence around that in a complex school. And of course, a lot of that stuff comes from evidence-informed reading. And this is what I love. I love this phrase of evidence-informed wisdom. That teachers have to be validated for the wisdom they have. You say to teachers that you are wise because you know your class, you know your subject. And that's important, that you're constantly trying to sort of add to the wisdom that you have. And research evidence can filter into that. But unless the CPD process allows the teacher to connect evidence with their existing sense of themselves and their students and their subject, it won't go anywhere. So whether it's an ethic of excellence or Teach Like a Champion or Carol Dweck's stuff or Graham Nuttall or whatever, all that is kind of interesting, but makes no difference unless it filters in, unless the teacher assimilates that and it becomes a part of their new sense of what decisions to take and so on. So it's useful to sort of have a framework, and you can debate things, and you can have good training where we explore things like what does the growth mindset literature say, what does the metacognition literature say, what does Bloom's taxonomy actually mean, and no, it's not regurgitating facts at the bottom. There are frameworks like these things. They're all possible contenders for the framework. But whatever you do, and there are some books. Look at all the books. Some of these I'm helping make. Others are just classic books. I really think. And volume 2 of this book is coming out in about 2 weeks, 27th of June. I looked it up earlier. Can't wait. But again, even though it's a great book, it doesn't make any difference unless it's filtering in. So we need that to be in our mind, and so we need teachers to feel that they're part of this process. So this is why judgment cultures are toxic to CPD. They just don't work. It's not going to help. So when I go to the back of a class and have this privileged position of watching that teacher thing, the idea that I'm there to judge them feels to me now, having done this myself and had to write these reports and stuff, I just think it's a kind of professional stain on ourselves that we allow this to be part of what people think they're supposed to do, to go into a teacher's space and say that is good or not good, or I think it's deeply wrong because it's so complicated. And you see a teacher who's really working their socks off. They're marshalling all their resources. They've got their curriculum. They're trying to think 3 steps ahead. They've got a complicated set of individuals in front of them. And you're sitting at the back sort of watching this whole thing being, you think, wow, look at that person doing all that. And still, you've got Stephanie and Michael back here who are finding it hard. You've got John over there who hasn't said anything yet, and he's looking a bit tuned out and when you ask him, he doesn't really know what's happening. And that's despite the teacher trying so hard to deal with all those issues. So all I'm doing when I'm sitting in the back of that class, I'm thinking, what use am I going to be to this teacher? You know, how can I help them solve this really tough problem of making the children even more effective? I think that's my only kind of justifiable reason for being in that room, is if I can offer any help to that teacher doing that really difficult thing that they're trying to do. And I think I see that more and more because I see so many teachers who are doing incredible work. And I just think the idea that we have this judgment culture in our system is just so terrible. And it's still, in some schools, it's great. It's swift. It's gone. It's gone. It's long ago. They talk about the old days when they still used to grade lessons. But some schools are still doing it and still needing to work through it. This is the deal. I go into that class and I think, what challenges do your students face? You know, why is this topic, this concept, this material hard? What activities are happening where you're trying to address those issues? And then what challenges do you experience doing that? And I'm sympathetic on that level as well. Like, it is hard. I've got these intentions, but what are the barriers to getting them to be successful? And can I offer some support? And that is what I'm trying to do. So all the processes that we have in schools need, I think, to create that dialogue. What are the challenges? How are you trying to address them? How do we overcome the problems that is? And then what are the solutions? Now, there are lots of ways teachers can engage with this discussion in between their training. So I did this. This is my most recent blog. If you look it up, about models of CPD, like this one here is sort of a team model where you've got the red dot is a kind of like a leader, but you've basically got a group of people who share some discussions, they go off and teach, and they come back and reflect, and they go off and teach, and they come back and reflect. So you have these cycles of small groups of people reflecting on these problems, and sometimes they observe each other in between. Here you've got what is a paired discussion. So you've got a slightly larger team maybe, and people pair up. So you and me, we're kind of like, we help each other, and I observe you, you observe me, or we do what is called unseen observations, and then we talk about the issues, and we meet quite regularly because we can. Then we go back into our team and say, right, this is how we're getting on. This is what we're finding. There's that's one version. This is a kind of coached pair. So you two are in the same team. This is quite common in primary schools where you've got a senior leader supporting, say, the year 5 team where there's 2 teachers. And it's constantly like, what's working well, what's not working well, what can we do better? And they kind of meet as a 3. But one of the people isn't actually doing it. It's the other 2, and they're just being supported. And here you've got a triad. So I know a school where it runs this great system where everyone's in triads, where the 3 people discuss. And they regularly report back to a person who's outside of them, just to sort of check in. And that person is skilled at asking them questions like, so what are you trying to achieve? And how do you know it's working? And which students are thriving, and why does that work? And so which students are not, why does that not work? And let's see, how's it going? And they show them things and they talk about it. And it sort of has a kind of accountability edge, but it's basically supportive, and they're modeling the kinds of questions. So to me, there's lots of different ways of doing CPD in this way. But probably the most strongly evidenced is instructional coaching. So instructional coaching is a process which teachers engage with in between lesson observations, if you like, or embedding them in between their team meetings, in between their whole school CPD meetings. And it's strongly evidenced, and it's got a whole pedigree. And I do think it's important to see this as part of this 3-stream system. So, you know, whether it's Jim Knight's instructional coaching book or Banbrick Santoyo's Leverage Leadership and his work, there are so many people. This is discussed, but for us in the Walkthrus world, this is our kind of central image. We like this image. It's 2 people, a coach and the teacher, side by side, not just symbolically, but kind of literally talking together, looking at a set of strategies and saying, what are we trying to achieve here? What are the learning problems? What are you trying to do about it? What can you do next? And the teachers are thinking, right, I'm using the coach as a sounding board, but really it's me thinking, what are the learning problems the children have got? What are the action steps I can take? And then committing to that. And the whole process supports this rich discussion, which really focuses on the solving of the problems. They may be getting some expertise from a whole school CPD session. They may be getting some from their team discussion in the maths department, but their coach is then the one that makes that become very precise to their situation week to week to week or month to month. So we have this sort of cycle of sessions where you meet, you discuss, you think through, you talk about strategies, and then you co-plan and you actually say, okay, so what are your intentions? Good. So let's see how that pans out. And then you go and observe. But before you've observed, you've already talked through, you've got this sort of shared understanding developing around the issues. And then when you're observing this teacher, you're thinking, oh, that's so interesting. I can see why that might be hard, and that's working, that's not. Okay. So that's when we meet to discuss that. We say, so that was working well because of that. And I could see that Stephen was really thriving now that you've scaffolded it a bit more. But what are the residual learning problems? And the teacher is saying, well, I still don't think that's going as well as I'd like. And you're saying, okay, great. So what's the next steps then? Where's the next thing? And the teacher says, this is what I need to do. It's that particular thing I need to nail. Right, let's go and see it. And then we have cycles. And this thing of this cycle of short interactions of planning and seeing how it works, reviewing things, and then identifying more specific action steps to take. This is the essence of instructional coaching, where we've got this coach who's got the capacity to suggest ideas, who knows the playbook. Jim Knight is great on this. I mean, he says it's not facilitative entirely. It's not just like letting the teacher come to their own conclusions and say, yeah, how do you feel? How did it go for you? And just being the kind of the neutral, unknowing person who kind of just barely, who just facilitates. It's also not entirely directive. You're not going into those meetings going, I need you doing this, I need you doing that. It's dialogic. And I think this is really important. Instructional coaching has this capacity to ebb and flow. So for some teachers, you just listen and probe, and then they suggest what they want to do, and you go, yeah, I totally get that. I think that's a great idea. Off you go. You haven't really said anything to them. And other teachers where it's more, I think probably this would be a better bet, because that's really not working as well, and try this, and you're much more directive. But you need to be able to flex between those things, and a skillful coach learns to do that. You also then need to have the playbook, because again, teaching has been studied, it's been researched. There are lots of playbooks. Teach Like a Champion is a superb playbook. Making Every Lesson Count is a superb set of playbooks for teachers. And our Walkthrus book is written to try to be a playbook. It's like there are so many options that you've got. Some schools have got, Rosenshine's principles type CPD teaching frameworks that they've written. But what's really helpful, and this is where the whole school CPD comes in, is to make sure there's a strongly understood shared language of the sorts of things which are contenders. So the Walkthrus chapter headings, I mean, they're so obvious, aren't they? They're behaviour and relationships, curriculum planning, explaining and modelling, questioning and feedback, practice and retrieval. And mode B teaching is kind of things which kind of broaden and enrich the curriculum, which make it more than only instructional teaching. So we've got a list of sort of things that you might choose, but different schools have got different playbooks, but you need to have something. Without a go-to resource, a lot of schools are sort of doing this sort of like handing things on almost hand to mouth, or very kind of old teaching and learning frameworks they've written, and they become sort of atrophied because they're not exposed to the community of practice outside. The good thing about these sort of things is that people from different places are batting them around, and they kind of get thrashed out, and you get communities beyond the school. So in this complex three streams arena, a clear framework that is well understood is really powerful. So in the whole school session, in the team session, in the coach triad session or the instructional coaching session, the kind of general principles about how learning works, the school level thrash out of what's our values versus what's the evidence say has already been played out. So we've got this sort of coherence building because everyone is using a similar toolkit. That can be very, very useful. And then, as Jim Knight says, you need to be able to be responsive in a sense that you can be precise. You can say, this is what you need to do. First it's this, then do that, then the other. So we coach through very precise steps. Or more provisional, allow teachers to say, no, of course it depends, and change things to adapt them. So adapting is adapting strategies to suit the context is so important. One of the things which sends shivers down my spine is whenever I hear at the school saying, these have become our non-negotiables. Because as soon as that's true, you're thinking, well, how can that be? That doesn't mean anything to me. Because clearly, if you've involved the staff in agreeing certain things we all do, you've explicitly negotiated them. So you might have the maths department where we say, in maths, this is how we do maths. We have this type of starter activity. These are our question structures. These are our questioning structures. They're negotiated by the people in the team. So there might be things we've all agreed, but they're not non-negotiable. In fact, they were negotiated. And I think that's so important as a school. The framework that people use ought to be negotiated. Like, this is the thing we agree on. If you've had a say in a framework, you're more likely to use it. So adapting things has to be part of how we understand a framework for teaching, not the SLT person who's been on a course is coming in saying, right, guys, I've read a book. These are our non-negotiables. It's like, no, don't come to me with that. I'm resisting you just on principle, and I'm going to make that hard. And I've actually literally said this more than once to someone, to say, look, if I was in your school, I would literally resist what you just said, because I've been a physics teacher. I was pretty good at it, and what you just said, I would never do that in my lessons. So why would you be saying that has to be done? Because it's not actually true. So you've got to be careful to sort of become one of these people that mandates things to people when really it's not supported by the evidence, and actually doesn't work in terms of teachers buying in and so on. But of course, one part of this is understanding that the way that we understand learning, so the model of learning. And I love this discussion. I mean, it's hilarious to people when people sort of say this is some reductive model, because it so isn't. I was discussing with people today, there's so many things that come from this and how it works, and the idea that anyone thinks that there's a kind of box of memory which fills up. And, I think we give teachers some credit. Basically, this is a schematic diagram which represents a complex fluid process, and we create a simple diagram so that we can talk about the complexity. The complexity is always there. Diagrams are just a way of allowing us to reference a whole range of things. And anyone who thinks that teachers are reducing memory to as if working memory fills up, and it's just idiotic. But it's a really helpful thing to say, look, have we thought about attention? Attention isn't paying attention. Attention is attention mentally. Like, am I focusing on the thing in hand? How do I secure attention across the classroom? How do I engineer activities so that children are using their prior knowledge, selecting and organizing ideas from the environment or things they've directed their attention to, so that they can integrate that new thinking with their existing schema, and then through the thinking lead to a more secure or enriched schema. And by practicing that, rehearsing that, building some fluency and avoiding forgetting things and so on. So the way we understand learning problems through a mental model, I think, is really powerful. And when teachers start saying, okay, that's why I need to do some practice and repetition is useful. That's why I need to get everyone thinking through cold calling. Because if I don't, some children are not thinking and others are, yes. So there's a reason for cold calling. There's a reason for retrieval practice. There's a reason for getting children to talk and explain in pairs. Yes. And then we have to think about the complexity of amplifying that to a whole class. So I've tried to teach something, and how do I know it's happening? So this is where something like Rosenshine's principles is so powerful. It's one of the many frameworks which people find useful, because, as he says, there are different bodies of research which influence it. And, some of them, these studies are quite old. That doesn't bother me. But it's the general sense that these are sensible things that teachers find sensible, and it provides a framework for us to talk about our practice. So you've got this framework which allows us to have a set of reference points. So sensibly, teachers review material, they ask questions, they sequence models, sequence concepts in small steps, they use modeling and scaffolding. So you've got this playbook, and whether it's this or some other thing, you've got a set of ideas, and sometimes we then expand that a bit. So questioning techniques, these are my go-to questioning techniques. So instead of talking about questioning techniques, we're talking about cold calling or no opt-out. Those come from Teach Like a Champion, or check for understanding, probing questioning. Those are really things which Rosenshine talks about a lot. Think, pair, share, say it again better. Say it again better is one of my favorite ones. It's basically a second time round to explain something more fluently, and practicing sort of a short feedback loop verbally. All of these things are great. So a playbook of questioning techniques within the field of questioning is useful, because then we can start talking to each other about how well we're doing our cold calling. So then we get into this thing of the feedback conversation. So in the Bambrick's and Toyer's book, we've summarized this in our volume 2 walkthroughs, this 5-step process. I think it's superb. I've come together with a teacher to discuss their lesson. we've got this shared framework out there of techniques, and they're working on, say, I don't know, they're cold calling. So I go and I give precise praise. I don't just say, hey, lovely lesson, that was a stunning lesson, awesome, because that's kind of supporting the idea that that's my role to judge you. I don't do that. I inhibit that. And I say, I think of a reason why the lesson was effective. And I say, well done. I could really see you cold calling really well then, because I could sort of, the way that Jason gave that answer, and normally he wouldn't have been saying anything, but you made sure he was involved, and you got Melissa to give a really good response. That was great. And that's really working well now. The students are much more likely to think about the questions because they're expecting to give answers. That's going well. And you give precise praise. But then you probe, you say, so, but what about, what are you finding? Do you think the answers are long enough? Do you think are you engaging with the responses? And we look at the definition of cold calling and how to get into it. So we start saying, how could it be even better still? And then we say, so what's the issue then? The issue is still some of the students still are less verbal, less confident. Maybe we could get even more students to give even better answers and sustain the cold calling for a longer part of the lesson. And who gives that? Well, the teacher might be saying that themselves, or you might be. And then you say, right, so what do we do next? Next time, let's see if let's drill down something specific. And the teacher then does that. So we need to then have this practice process of saying, let's make sure you've understood that then before we go ahead. You can't just say to a teacher, do something if they don't know what that is. So do we understand what the process will be when you're doing it better? So there needs to be a sort of practice element built in somehow. And then we say, right, so when? And Bambrick Santorio says this is one of the most common reasons why stuff doesn't work. We just don't nail it down. We don't just say, oh, well, you'll go off and prove sometime in the future. Go off and play around with your cold calling for a bit and see what happens. No, you have to say, so I've got my year 8s next Tuesday, and they're the class I'm particularly focusing on. So in that lesson, and then over the next 3 weeks, I'm really going to get in amongst that cold calling. So I'll say, okay, so I'll come back and I'll see that lesson then. Let's see how it's going. Great, well done. And I'll see you then. And we plan it, and it's part of the plan. Who writes it all down? In my opinion, the teacher does. So the tools that we're devising are like the teacher that says, okay, boom, boom, quick, short record, and that's it. No big lesson report. The teacher is writing down their action steps and off they run. So that's what instructional coaching can feel like. And within that, you've got definitions of things like the cold calling steps are, well, is it the way that you've selected is it the way you're asking them? Is it the way you respond to their answers? Is it the number of students you engage? There's all sorts of subtleties, even within cold calling. So we've gone from questioning techniques to cold calling, and then within cold calling to the specific part of it. We can get quite fine-grained about this. Or we can link. So we have this idea in Walkthrus called cluster builder, where we say sometimes it's actually the way ideas come together that's the issue. So if you're cold calling a lot, it can end up being a bit stifling because you've asked them and you've asked them and you've asked them and you've asked them and you've asked them, and that might be 8 or 9 students, but you've still got 20 students who haven't said anything yet, and they need time to practice. So you say, okay, let's do a pair share now. And then when you're cold calling, what are the questions you're asking? Are they process questions? Are they probing questions? Are we checking for understanding? And are we getting students to have a second go at their explanation? So saying it again better. So this repertoire of techniques kind of works as a whole. And sometimes our action steps are about combining strategies, not the detail. So it's so interesting. All of these are variables. Or it could be behavior management, being assertive and getting the kids to keep on task. There's so many different things. So in the final analysis, this is what we're trying to do. We're not trying to make teachers better, actually. We're trying to solve learning problems. That's what it's all about. We're trying to make teachers have more confidence around solving the problems that children have got with the learning. And for me, that's such an important frame to have around this. If you can say it's the same thing as teachers being better, but I actually think that's one of the things we've gone wrong with our system, that because of that, we've got defensiveness. We've got people saying, only observe me twice a year. It's insane. If we think the whole purpose, the whole structure is geared around how do we all work together so that the children are more effective in their learning, then we're all in it together. And I've given you guys, in my school, jobs to be in the school because you're a great bunch of people. But I know teaching is hard, and I know it's not easy, and I know it's hard to sustain. So why would I judge you? I'm here to support you. And if I don't mean that, then I shouldn't be doing it. So how do we go about it? We constantly review student performance. How's it going? We identify the most precise problem points we can. Where do they find it hard? Why is it difficult? Why does that student find it difficult, whereas that student's flying? So how do I deal with this? And what strategies then link? So what strategies bridge from that to that? So in our walkthroughs work, we try to encourage people to do this kind of like problem solving thing. So, if, then, so that. And it's not too rigid about this. It's kind of just a mind frame. If this is a problem, then use this strategy so that this happens. That's a behavior cluster. Or I'm questioning, or retrieval practice. If this is the issue, then perhaps this is a strategy so that this will be the outcome. And you've got a kind of a logic to the strategy dealing with an issue. And then remembering this frame here, it all weaves back into the practice cycle, and it goes into all of these processes. Some of these processes work much better at whole school, like, let's have a whole school session on memory so that we really got that embedded in our school understanding. The individual processes are about enacting these things, week to week and month to month. And the team processes are where we really articulate these things through the lens of curriculum and the specific things that we provide, the resourcing, the flow of questions. There's so many very subject-specific things where pedagogy and curriculum just sort of are inseparable, and team discussions around those problems are so valuable because the expertise is located there around those issues. So that's why we have 3 streams, because they all play a role, and a toolkit to support that is something which is useful, and that's kind of one of the things we've been working on with our walkthrough stuff. So hopefully you found that useful. I'm going to stop sharing now and see if there's any questions, if there's any time for that.
Tom, that was fascinating. Thank you very much. We do have some questions here. Can you hear me, Tom?
Yeah.
Okay, here's a really good question. Does paired coaching work best if pairs are from the same subject area at secondary level? And how often do coaching sessions happen? And lastly, how do you quality assure the process?
Wow. Okay. I actually personally feel that coaching is best done within subject pairs because there's so much noise around generalism. So I feel like if we can sort of talk about curriculum and pedagogy together and we understand the challenge, but I wouldn't say it's an absolute. So I have seen some coaching pairs worked across subjects around some questioning techniques and some behavior management, for example. So it does depend on the focus, but if you have to pick one and as a planning device, I would say go within pairs within. How do you know it's happening well? Well, I think you need to have a sort of external reporting. So people so I like the sort of thing of a team and then people in pairs and they come back into their teams and say, this is what we've been doing. If you know there's a moment we have to kind of report in, you kind of have something to work towards and then you check the process of that. But that's evidence through things like, is the work improving? Let's see it. I've observed a really amazing coaching process where the teachers brought in examples of how their marking strategy was impacting the work. And they said, look at that now. Look at what it was like before. And now look at what it's doing now. And it's like, it was properly evidenced. And that was the way they were doing it. It was really interesting. So there is evidencing through assessment and ultimately if the students are learning more. How frequent? Well, I think this is a real variable. I'm personally not a big fan of thinking you must make this sort of like a weekly thing. A lot of schools are just thinking, oh, that's weird. It's never going to work. But I do feel like some issues do need longer to embed. So if I'm going to work on my scaffolding technique for a whole sort of writing process, it might take me 3 or 4 weeks to kind of really get it going and then get some good results. And then it's worth then coming back to look at it. So some things need longer. If it's a behavior management issue, well, I don't want you to leave you struggling with your difficult year 9s for long. So get cracking on that now. Like you can do those tomorrow, and then I'll maybe come back in next week because I don't want you sort of being murdered by them. I want you to be, so you some things need a tighter loop because of the nature of the content, rather than some absolute truth that it should be this sort of minimum frequency.
Another question here, I think, which is an extremely important one. How do you think schools can effectively monitor and quality assure teaching without using judgment of lessons?
Well, but I just don't think lessons are the right thing to do. Is, okay, we've discussed this issue. You've agreed to do these things. Are you doing them? If a teacher isn't following through on their own action steps, that's where the real accountability lies. So I feel that's the main thing. The quality assurance comes through teachers earnestly following through on their commitments in a coaching discussion. And it's where they're not even doing the things they said they were going to do that you've got an issue. And that's I feel, where the judgment comes in, rather than was that a good lesson, which to me has become a kind of almost like a meaningless question to ask.
Fantastic, Tom. That's it. We're out of time. Thanks for everyone who watched, and see you all again soon.
Thanks, everybody.
It's my great honour to welcome you all.
It is a very prestigious award. It means the world to me.
They have great senses of humour.
I like to reveal parts of history to them, for I love making history come alive.
They are some of the best people that you can come across.
To help them open their hearts.
I always come back to this quote. How can we be role models to learners if we're not learners ourselves?
It's quite useful to get out of our bubbles, not our COVID ones, and sort of see what else is out there.
By sharing best practice, we can see the whole picture. We can see what really matters.
Has one of the biggest brains around.
It's easy to forget how much has to happen behind the front lines.
As a global schools group, Cognita educates over 55,000 students across 12 countries. We're proud to be Wellbeing Partner at this year's Festival of Education, and we want to share the work that we're doing to prioritise children's well-being. This starts with a clear understanding of what well-being is. We looked at the evidence and created a simple Be Well charter that everyone can use day to day. It gives a clear definition of well-being and then focuses on the specific contributors that influence it. Discover our full Be Well charter video and other resources to use with your students and families at cognita.com.
I really try to not look at myself as just a science teacher. I feel like as a teacher, it's very important to help students grow and develop outside of your lessons. A single teacher believing in you and really believing in you. One teacher doing that can have a large impact, but if you have one or two or three all telling you that and really, really believing in it, it makes you feel like you can achieve anything in the world, honestly.